This is a fat quarter. A fat quarter is a piece of cloth that's approximately 18 inches by 22 inches. 18 inches being half a yard, fabric being about 44 inches wide in the United States. And this is the width of the fabric. It usually comes with a little cardboard square inside of it to make it look pretty and lie nicely on the shelf. And this is what's known as quilting cotton. If I look closely at it, this does not appear to have a selvage edge. But a selvage edge is usually a much more dense piece of fabric along one edge, which frequently looks fuzzy. Here's a different fat quarter, and this one has a selvage edge. A selvage edge is going to look like that. It's going to have little holes in it. It's going to have some fuzz along one side. That's only going to exist along one side. And that this sort of means that this was cut from a piece of scrap fabric sort of in the middle of a fat quarter or of a quarter yard. So it is a half yard of fabric which has then been cut in half along the width of the fabric. And in this case, it also appears that the selvage edge up here has been trimmed off. You can get really fussy and fancy about these. I tend not to. What I do is I spray them down or I soak them. I usually don't have any water in the iron itself, but I have the iron on a fairly high heat. So what happens is that I'm going to steam the water out of this as it dries. And I set the iron to one of the two cotton settings on it and iron this out. A fat quarter in any fabric is a really useful size for a lot of magical projects. This is a suitable size for making a tarot deck case or bag with a drawstring, and maybe I'll do that as another project, or for making a bag for runes or Kolbren or autumn divination, or some kind of letter divination system, or as I said, for a tarot bag or some kind of an oracle deck. In a lot of traditional materials, there's a saying that silk and linen insulate, and wool and cotton dissipate magical energies over time, or at least don't seal them in and contain them. And if you're making a talisman in a lot of magical processes, they'll often suggest that the talisman be wrapped in silk or linen while you are banishing various forces. It's not uncommon for me to make a linen bag to contain certain of my magical tools so that they don't dissipate energy in between uses when I'm not having them out on the altar. Now, if you're making a very particular piece of magical gear and you want to be really precise, the threads along the edge of a fat quarter can sometimes be pulled free. It's much harder to do this with cotton than it is to do it with linen, but it can be done, and you can get a clean edge, not just on one side, but on all four sides. I don't think I'm going to do this because all I'm doing is scrunching up the fabric here. But you should know that it's possible to do. It's also possible to do something called gathering or thread pulling, where you find one of these threads and you don't so much pull it as slide it out of the fabric. And you can see that the fabric is sort of gathering up along this one thread that I have pulled. You don't want to pull on the thread because the thread itself is very fragile and I've just broken it. But sometimes you can create a channel in the fabric and use that channel as a marker or a guide for pulling out a single thread, and then you have a line that you can then cut along. I've demonstrated this in another video, which I'll post. In this particular case, of course, that side is probably going to come mostly off, so I'm going to leave it. What I'm going to do, though, is I know that the fabric is roughly 18 inches square, and what I'm going to do is iron my fabric so that this diagonal is pressed into the fabric like that. And then I'm going to take this over to the sewing table and I'm going to cut along this diagonal, and I'm going to cut off this piece along the side. And then I'll come back. Part of my reason for making these videos is to demonstrate that you don't necessarily need all of the fancy gear that you see in quilting videos in order to be able to make some of the projects that we need to make for magical purposes. As Sara Mastros said in Sorcery of Solomon, this is not a work of scholarship, this is a game of scholarship, and similarly, this is not an art project, this is a sorcery project, right? So getting these things completely perfect isn't always necessary. To cut a piece of fabric, you need good scissors that are sharp. Fabric scissors are ideal, but not strictly necessary. You get a better cut with fabric scissors. You can save this piece for another project. But now I've got a square. I'm going to move this over here and unfold my square. And this cut means that I have a nice clean line. Let me just make sure that the camera is set up properly. Yeah. Woven fabric, like quilting cotton, has relatively little stretch from side to side or side to side this way. You can see that even this fabric doesn't stretch very much this way. It stretches a lot this way, and then it stretches a lot from the corners because fabric is arranged in squares or in a grid because of warp and weft. Woven fabric is. Now, before I cut this, I got very little stretch this way. I got a lot of stretch this way, and I got a lot of stretch this way. So what I'm going to do is take this piece and line it up like that. And I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch in from the edge along this line. To use my ruler and say, okay, that 1/4 inch line is there. Now, if you are not a skilled sewist or you do not have a machine, after you mark your line, you're going, and you might want to use a piece of chalk for that, or a white marker, or something that's going to show up against your dark blue fabric. You would put pins in along this way. If you're going to hand sew this, you're going to want to pin along this line so it doesn't move, and you know that you're sewing directly along that line. I'm a skilled enough sewist at this point that I don't feel any compunction about putting this into my sewing machine and doing it that way. I have a fairly fancy machine. It can do a lot of things, but right now I'm just taking a straight stitch right down my line. I want to try to keep wrinkles out of my two triangles. And I'm going to take a little bit of a back stitch at the beginning. Ta-da! If I were going to hand stitch this, that would be its own kind of trouble. So now I've got a parallelogram. Here it is in the corners. And what I'm going to do is, you can see that there's a lot of stretch this way and quite a lot of stretch this way. And I sort of always forget which direction bias binding is supposed to go. But you can sort of look at the grain and see which way the grain is going. And ultimately what we're going to do is stitch these sides together, but we want to mark our fabric first. And you'll notice that I've lined these up, right? You can't see that because it's off camera. I've lined these up as a package, and it feels like that's how it's supposed to go together, but it's not actually supposed to go together like that. It's supposed to go together not like this, where it's all neat and lined up, but like this at a little bit of an angle. See how it's off on this side and more especially off on this side? That's because what we're going to do is, if they line up like this, they're going to get, when we cut them, all we're going to get is a set of ribbons, right? We're going to, if we lined them up exactly and then we cut it in strips, we would get 5 or 6 loops out of this fabric. Instead, what we're going to do is catty corner it a little bit, and it's going to come out in one continuous line. So let's see if I can do that and keep the camera properly oriented. Now, those strips that I made before were, I think, 1.5 inches. And this is a ruler that is set for 2 inches pretty easily. So here's one ruler, here's 2, and just for the sake of argument, let's do 2, because it's the same process either way, because geometry is geometry. And I'll be able to finish that line down over here, and then I can go use that line to mark again, and again. again. And again. And again. And I want to make sure that I carry my lines all the way up to the edge of the fabric, because I'm going to use those to line up my fabric as I cut it. And just as I did this in one direction, I also have to do this down on the other end of the piece of fabric. I don't have to go quite so far. I'm mostly there on most of these lines. Now, when I sew these, as I said, the first thing I want to do is I want to trim off this little chunk. And if you're using right-handed scissors, they say you should really cut so that the waste is to the right. That is to say, the part that you're going to throw away or not use is to the right of the scissors, and that helps ensure a cleaner cut. With fabric scissors in particular, it's a good idea to have your scissors resting on the flat, solid surface underneath. There we go. Now, under normal circumstances, you would just think, oh, it's supposed to get aligned like that, right? Here's my edge, here's my edge. I'm just going to line up ends with ends and everything will be hunky-dory. But the reality is that I want to skip the first one, and this is my seam, right? So that when I cut it, when I start cutting here, I'm going to get one continuous strip beginning to end. So here we go. I've sewn my two triangles, two halves of a square, in the direction of the bias. And if you look at this, you can see that the sort of diamond shapes of the fabric are running at a diagonal relative to the bias tape. And this is the thing that gives it its enormous flexibility as a fabric structure. And this makes a nice addition to a lot of different projects. You can use it to trim the top of a tarot bag, or you can use it to hem the edge of an altar cloth, or otherwise create any sort of structure that you want a contrasting color, like the edge of a sleeve, for example, if you're making a ceremonial robe, or the lower edge of a ceremonial robe, where it's going to add weight and drape and contrasting color, but not necessarily change the overall structure of the fabric. And I'm not cutting very carefully along this line because I know that the raw edge, the cut edge, is going to wind up inside the bias tape. So small variations as you cut along this line are not going to make all that much difference. You do want to be careful as you go that you're not cutting through a different part of this. Like, this is a little bit like making a very long Mobius strip. And there's always the risk that you're going to catch 2 layers of fabric rather than just one. It's also the case that the width of your initial ribbon, we did 2 inches, but I've done 1.5 inches, I've done 1 inch, I've done 3/4 of an inch to get some really tiny thin bias tape, means that you've got this underlying structure, but it also sort of determines how many times around a given fat quarter you can go. I used about half of the bias tape from a full fat quarter, and incidentally, this process works for a scrap of fabric of any size as long as you can make it square, right? If it's woven fabric, you can't do this with like t-shirt fabric, jersey, or knit fabrics of any kind, but it's sort of the number of loops, not the number of loops, what am I trying to say? The number of times that you go around is partially determined by how wide you make the fabric. But this green mat is 2 feet wide, and I'll probably lose this section here because it's just so close to a seam, but that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, not quite 8. 2 times 8 is 16, so we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 feet of bias tape out of an 18-inch square. And then this can be taken over to the ironing board, and we'll turn it into bias tape. So in a previous video, I showed you the little device, blue plastic and metal, called a bias tape maker, which you can buy at Joann's or other similar stores. And they're pretty nice to have. But you don't need one of those tools. You can just sort of eyeball it and say, okay, I want my final tape to be about that wide. And this is just me sort of folding in the edges. Now, bias tape is floppy because it's cut at a roughly 45-degree angle. So it's important to wet it down. You can use a spray bottle. You can soak it in the sink and squeeze most of the water out of it. But one way or another, it's more likely to get pressed and have sort of a clean edge if you're starting with slightly wet bias tape to begin with. And I'll pull this down so that the top of this is on camera. And again, the goal is that you're sort of folding in. The goal is that you're sort of folding in both sides because you want to fold it again, right? So that the cut edge is inside of the ribbon. And if it's wet, it's going to sort of hold some of this shape automatically. And then the heat is going to press it. And ideally, you only have to press once, right? Because you want to close this up. Oh. with the heat from the iron as you go, so that as it dries, it's sticking in this shape. And I'm making yellow bias tape, even though our instructions say to do it in blue. And I'm using blue marker and blue thread so that this stuff shows up a bit more. Look at how much, if you've done this correctly, see how much stretch there is in that? Like, it's got a lot of movement and maneuverability. It will have less once you sew the finished edge shut, but it gives you a sense. Now, as you pull the iron back, you're going to hit some bumps, because bias tape is always going to have bumps from seams in it. So you can't just run the iron back this way. You have to sort of press and lift, press and lift, press and lift. And again, this process can be a lot faster if you're a little bit more practiced, and if you're using a bias tape maker. With a bias tape maker, you're just sort of pulling this ribbon very gently through the machine, and the machine is doing a lot of the work. But there's nothing, if you don't have any of these fancy tools, there's sort of a way of treating this as part of the magical process, right? You're meditating on the way in which heat and moisture and coldness and dryness bring together the thing that you're making, and you're doing a meditation on the elements as we understand them in magical traditions, even as you're making bias tape, and that can be really valuable. And again, if the fabric is a little bit wet, this process goes a little bit faster, even if you're doing it by hand instead of with the aid of a machine. When you come to seams like this, it's a good idea to sort of finger press them open and fold in your cut edges, your raw edges, and then fold those over. And then apply the heat, because the heat is sort of going to fix them in this shape. And once they've been pressed, they're much more likely to stay in this shape for the long haul. I do not have a flat ironing board, so this is not as easy as it perhaps looks, or as easy as it would be on an old style wooden or metal ironing board. Again, finger press the wet fabric to the middle, toward the middle. Take the time to sort of finger press open your diagonal seams when you encounter them inside. That'll give you less bulk inside of the bias tape or ribbon. And then apply heat. I'm not really going to be able to use this bias tape for any particular purpose. I don't have much use for yellow bias tape to begin with, and for the sake of visibility on camera, I I used a marker that would show up on the yellow fabric, but it's also semi-water soluble, so it's bleeding through in places and making the fabric look not very good. So you can see that I've got quite a lot of bias tape at this point. I have quite a lot still to do. Like if this was a blue ribbon, I would have enough to do 2 books with the same ribbon. And I don't really need any more of this. So I think I'm going to stop it there because I've illustrated the process enough, and I'll finish that up later. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching this little tutorial on making bias binding. I finished all of that 18 feet of, or 16 feet of bias tape. So that's 16 feet of pressed bias tape all rolled up and pinned so that it doesn't come unraveled. And this is the blue bias tape that I made for my Sorcery of Solomon course. And I have a tape or ribbon on my Solomonic master book, not my master book, but my practice book, which was, half of this. And you can see that an 18-inch square of fabric is enough to produce quite a lot, right? That just in terms of size, even though I started with the same amount of fabric, you're producing quite a lot of the material with a fat quarter. And in the US, fat quarters now run between $3 and $5 depending on quality of fabric. Mostly quilting cotton is available in this format, and it gives you a sense of how we went from something like this to this. Thanks. Again, my name is Andrew Watt, and thank you for watching.